He who dares to kiss these lips is by fate condemned to die. These lines, heavy with dark prophecy, belong to the poet Ivan Maslov. In an irony worthy of a Greek tragedy, the author himself did not live long after writing them, as if the unseen fate he dared to name had taken it as a personal offense. The poet passed, but his words became eternally bound to the woman who inspired them, serving as her second shadow epitaph. Her name was Aurora, Aurora Karlovna Stjernvall. She was born in 1808 to the roar of cannons from the Russo-Swedish War, the daughter of the Viborg governor, a man of Swedish blood who served the Russian Empire faithfully. Her name, meaning dawn, seemed to promise light and hope. Instead, it became synonymous with the twilight that gathered over every man who dared to love her. She did not enter history as a socialite, a patron of the arts, or an empress's lady-in-waiting, though she was all of these. She was remembered as a woman of fate, the bearer of an invisible seal that condemned her chosen ones to an untimely end. Imagine a biography that reads like a martyrology, a list of names, each one associated with a brilliant future with talent, wealth, and power, yet all cut short by the same note: sudden and brutal tragedy. Her destiny was more than just a series of sad coincidences. It was a phenomenon that her contemporaries tried to explain with mysticism, curses, and the evil eye. Today, however, we will attempt to look deeper into this story, to separate fact from legend. We will follow the path of this astonishing woman whose beauty was rumored to bring not happiness, but drama. Twice she stood at the altar with men from Russia's most illustrious families, and both times her marital bliss proved to be terrifyingly brief. So, what was it? A cruel destiny, or a tragic coincidence magnified by the power of human gossip? Let us investigate. Our heroine's story begins not in glittering St. Petersburg, but in Helsingfors, now known as Helsinki. The city, having just become the capital of the Grand Duchy of Finland, was buzzing with ambition, transforming before one's eyes from a modest port into an imperial outpost. It was here, in this melting pot of cultures and hopes, that the three Stjernvall sisters grew up, destined to become legends of local society. Even in their early youth, however, it was clear that one of them was special. At home, she was affectionately called Rory, and it was she, Aurora, the fiery brunette, whose beauty seemed to have absorbed all the passion of a southern night, while her younger sister Emily shone with the gentleness of a northern blonde. Their appearance was a generous gift of fate, but their parents had also tended to their substance. The sisters received an excellent education, spoke several languages, and were poised to dazzle. And dazzle Aurora did. At 16, as was expected of a young woman of her station, she made her debut into society. Picture the scene: ballrooms filled with the scent of wax, perfume, and flowers, the rustle of silk, the glint of epaulets. In this whirlwind, the debutante Rory was not just one of many. She was an event. Her arrival, as a smitten poet wrote, was like the morning dawn for which she was named. A swarm of admirers instantly formed around her, but two gentlemen stood out with particular brilliance, like light and shadow converging in a battle for her attention. On one side, the poet Yevgeny Baratinsky, a delicate, melancholic genius whose soul spoke in verse. He saw in Aurora an ethereal creature, a muse, and dedicated lines to her filled with timid delight and quiet longing. For whom does she bring forth the sun of happiness? On the other side, Colonel Alexander Mukhanov. If Baratinsky was a soft light, Mukhanov was a dazzling flash of lightning. A handsome man with piercing blue eyes, he carried a loud and scandalous reputation in society. A regular at gambling dens, the hero of countless amorous affairs, a profligate who burned through life with a fierce energy, that was his portrait. Women, having been scorched by his cold flame, nicknamed him the Blue-Eyed Demon, a moniker that perfectly captured his essence, the face of an angel and the reputation of a fallen one. He too wrote poetry, but his verses were merely another facet of his untamable nature, not its core. These two suitors, the poet and the demon, were friends, but their friendship quickly fractured when Aurora appeared on the horizon, and the young, inexperienced soul made her choice. As is so often the case, she was drawn not to the quiet harbor, but to the raging ocean. She chose Mukhanov. Perhaps she was captivated by his audacious beauty, his aura of danger and power, so unlike the measured life in the governor's house. It was the first true, all-consuming love, against which Baratinsky's timid verses and all common sense were powerless. The poet, realizing his quiet voice could not shout down the storm, gracefully stepped aside, leaving the field of battle for the beauty's heart to his rival, more fortunate, as it seemed at the time. Aurora and Alexander were certain of their happiness, but they had overlooked one thing: the opinion of their families, who viewed this union with equal horror, albeit for different reasons. Aurora's parents, the Stjernvalls, were distraught by their future son-in-law's reputation. To give their daughter, as pure as the morning dawn, into the hands of the blue-eyed demon, whose escapades were the talk of society, seemed to them the height of recklessness. It was a stain on the family's honor, a risk to their Rory's future. The Mukhanov family, in turn, viewed the situation with cold pragmatism. Aurora was dazzlingly beautiful, but she had no fortune. Governor Stjernvall was an honest servant of the state, not a corrupt official, and his family, though noble, could not boast of wealth. The Mukhanovs expected their son to make a profitable match that would mend his finances, which had been ravaged by gambling and a life of luxury. And soon, the groom himself, his initial ardor having cooled, began to see the situation through the same eyes. Love was one thing, but living on a modest officer's salary, deprived of his accustomed splendor, was something he was not prepared to do. Illusions shattered against the prose of life. The treachery of the blue-eyed demon was not only cruel, but also cowardly. Instead of a direct conversation, instead of an honest, albeit painful break, Alexander Mukhanov chose a path of silent flight. He used his connections to secure a transfer to bustling St. Petersburg, and one day simply vanished from Aurora's life, leaving behind only a trail of bitter rumors and bewildered questions. For a young woman whose heart had just learned the power of true feeling, this was not merely a disappointment, it was a betrayal that shattered her faith in love and in people. She waited, hoping for a letter, a message, some explanation that might help her piece the fragments of her world back together. But Mukhanov remained silent, and his silence was more deafening than any words. He seemed to have erased her from his life, easily and ruthlessly, like crossing out a losing bet in a card game. Aurora's father, Karl Stjernvall, a man of honor and duty, took this situation as a personal insult. He saw his daughter suffering, heard the whispers behind their backs, and understood that any delay threatened to turn his family into a laughingstock for all of Helsingfors society. In his world of strict rules and unshakable notions of reputation, a jilted bride was a brand, and he, as a loving, if authoritarian father, decided to act swiftly and decisively. He would not allow the ghost of Mukhanov to continue poisoning his Rory's life. A solution was found quickly in the best tradition of aristocratic alliances. A new groom was chosen for Aurora. He was to be her cousin, the young and respected Carl Gustav Mannerheim, a scion of a distinguished line. This was a choice dictated by reason, not by the heart. Reliable, decent, one of their own. The perfect match to wash away the shame and secure a stable, honorable future for his daughter. Aurora, devastated and having lost all hope of her first, albeit destructive love returning, slowly submitted to her father's will. Apathy reigned in her soul. She did not love her cousin, but she had no strength left to resist. In that era, respectable young women obeyed their fathers, and marriage was less a union of two hearts than a social and familial contract. She drifted with the current, meekly accepting her fate. The wedding day was set, the gown was being sewn, the house was being prepared for the celebration. Everything proceeded in an orderly fashion, bringing closer the day she would stand at the altar with a man for whom she felt nothing more than familial affection. Perhaps, in the secret corners of her soul, she prayed for a miracle, for some deliverance from this bland, joyless future. She could not have known how terrifyingly and literally her prayers would be answered. And then, with the wedding just hours away, the unseen director of this drama dealt its first stunning blow. On the eve of the ceremony, the groom was gone. Young, vibrant Carl Gustav Mannerheim passed away suddenly in the prime of his life. The news struck the family like a bolt from the blue, plunging everyone into shock and terror. The festive preparations froze. The cheerful hum was replaced by an icy silence. But for Aurora, this event was something more than just a tragedy. In her mind, tormented by betrayal and an unwanted marriage, two things, her secret wish for the wedding not to happen and the sudden death of her fiancé, merged into a single, terrifying chain of cause and effect. She was seized not just by grief, but by a cold, clammy horror of realization. It is my fault. I am to blame. The terrible thought, like a poison, pulsed in her head. She was convinced that her selfish, desperate prayers for deliverance had been heard and answered by the most merciless force in the universe. God, or fate, had freed her from an unloved husband by taking his life. Now, on her conscience, she believed, lay not just a canceled wedding, but a man's ruined destiny. This guilt was so all-consuming that in a fit of despair, she swore a terrible oath that would define the rest of her life. Looking at the world with eyes full of tears and horror, she vowed that she would never, ever again consider marriage. She herself had become the curse, and the only way to stop it was to renounce love and matrimony forever. Aurora was unyielding in her resolve. The oath, sworn in a moment of supreme emotional turmoil, became for her an unbreakable law. She saw herself not merely as an unfortunate young woman, but as the bearer of some dark gift, a danger to anyone who drew near. To escape the scene of the tragedy, to flee the pitying and condemning gazes, she moved to Moscow. There, her sister Emily, the gentle blonde, was already comfortably married to Count Musin Pushkin, leading a calm and measured life. In this quiet family circle, Aurora found a temporary refuge. For several years, she lived far from the social whirl in the shadow of her more fortunate sister, trying to heal her wounds and keep her terrible vow. She transformed into a sorrowful, silent beauty, whose story elicited a mixture of pity and mystical curiosity from those around her. But fate, as is well known, is not so easily escaped, especially when it possesses a devilish sense of humor and a penchant for dramatic effect. One evening, at a Moscow ball that Aurora attended more out of duty than desire, her past caught up with her. In the throng of guests, she saw a familiar face and piercing blue eyes. It was him, Alexander Mukhanov. The blue-eyed demon had returned. In the intervening years, he had lost neither his charm nor his scandalous reputation, but upon seeing Aurora, he seemed to realize what he had thrown away. Perhaps, jaded by fleeting affairs and the glitter of capital life, he now saw in her matured beauty and hidden sorrow the very quiet harbor he had once so carelessly abandoned. For Aurora, this encounter was a cataclysm. All her vows, all her years of seclusion, the entire wall she had built around her heart, it all crumbled in an instant. Her first love, betrayed but never forgotten, flared up with a new, almost reckless intensity. This was a second chance, a gift from destiny, a redemption, or so it seemed to them both. Mukhanov was persistent and this time appeared sincere. He begged for forgiveness, swore eternal love, and insisted that now no obstacle, neither family nor finances, could keep them apart. And Aurora, desperate to believe in a miracle, believed him. She forgave him, casting aside her vow and the dreadful guilt that had haunted her. The wedding was set once more. It seemed that justice had triumphed, and the winding path of two hearts had finally led them to the altar. But the cruel force that had once before intervened in her destiny was merely watching, preparing its second, even more sophisticated blow. A few days before the ceremony, Alexander Mukhanov, true to his nature as a man who lived life to the fullest, decided to host a final bachelor's revelry. It was one last carousal, a farewell to freedom and all its temptations. The night was spent in a blur of wine, cards, and unbridled merriment. As dawn broke, when the cool August air already carried the first breath of autumn, the happy and flushed groom was returning home in an open carriage. This reckless act would prove fatal. He caught a cold, but at first paid it no mind. The cold, however, quickly developed into what was practically a death sentence in the 19th century, a swift and deadly pneumonia. The illness progressed with terrifying speed. The finest doctors were powerless. Aurora, who only yesterday had been radiant with happiness, now spent her days and nights by her fading lover's bedside, watching in horror as life slipped away from him. The end came on August 20th, 1834, the very eve of their planned wedding day. At the age of 31, Alexander Mukhanov, her blue-eyed demon, her first and, as she had believed, only love, was gone. Aurora was 26, twice a bride, and twice her path to the altar had been cut short by tragedy. If the first story had been a shock to her inner circle, the second became a sensation that spread through every salon in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Petersburg, from that moment on, a sinister fame attached itself firmly to Aurora Stjernvall. Fatal Aurora, the Black Bride, they whispered behind her back. It was no longer mere gossip, but a proven fact, confirmed by 2 untimely deaths. It is nearly impossible to imagine the feelings of a woman to whom fate had granted a second chance, only to snatch it away in the most brutal manner imaginable. A shadow of deep, inconsolable grief settled permanently upon her beautiful face. Moscow had become a city of ghosts for her, and she decided to flee once more to a place where nothing could remind her of the happiness she had lost. Aurora's path led her to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, where personal dramas quickly became public property and fame, especially of the notorious kind, spread like wildfire. But in Aurora's case, her sinister reputation had a paradoxical effect. It did not push society away. On the contrary, it drew all eyes to her. The story of the fatal beauty who had lost 2 fiancés on the eve of their weddings ignited the imagination. She became a living legend, a mystical enigma that everyone wished to solve. In her sorrowful gaze and restrained manners, people saw not just grief, but the mark of a chosen one, a sign of some higher tragic destiny. This was precisely the type of beauty that drove the Romantic era to madness, ethereal, melancholic, and dangerous. And St. Petersburg, with all its splendor and cynicism, fell at her feet. Soon, through the patronage of influential relatives, Aurora was appointed a lady-in-waiting to Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, the wife of Nicholas I. Now, attending balls, receptions, and official ceremonies was no longer a mere social pastime, but her official duty. She was constantly in the public eye, and her magnetism only intensified. Suitors flocked to her like moths to a flame, but they were driven less by romantic interest than by a thrill-seeker's dare. To capture the attention of fatal Aurora became a challenge, a game of chance with destiny itself. Every compliment, every dance with her felt like an act of courage. Were they in love with her or with her legend? Likely, it was both. Aurora, for her part, immersed herself in the strict and regimented world of court life, and for a time found a semblance of peace. She accepted the attention with cool politeness, listened to the compliments, but her heart remained closed. Her fame attracted not only idle cavaliers, but also the greatest minds of the age. Alexander Pushkin himself, a connoisseur of female beauty, took note of her, mentioning her in his letters and, according to rumor, dedicating a few lost lines to her. The poet Pyotr Vyazemsky also paid tribute to her charm in his verses. The composer Mikhail Vielgorsky, inspired by her grace, composed a mazurka and named it Aurora, a melody that became a sensation at St. Petersburg balls for years to come. Imagine the scene: Aurora whirling in a dance to music that bears her name, while the entire ballroom, holding its breath, watches this sorrowful queen, unsure whether to admire or fear her. Her mystique was further enhanced by rumors she herself may have unwittingly encouraged. It was whispered in society that she considered herself cursed and was seriously contemplating entering a convent. so as to bring no more misfortune upon anyone. And what 19th century knight, raised on the novels of Sir Walter Scott, would miss the chance to save a beautiful damsel from such a grim fate? And such a knight appeared, or rather, not a knight, but an industrial magnate, one of the richest men in the empire, Pavel Nikolaevich Demidov, the owner of the Ural factories, a philanthropist, collector, and a bon vivant known throughout Europe. He was a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. In high society, he was known by the French version of his name, Paul. Upon seeing Aurora at a court ball, Demidov became utterly captivated. Her cold, distant beauty became his obsession, a challenge to his will and his fortune. He began to court her. With all the flamboyant energy of his untamable nature, he showered her with flowers, bestowed incredible gifts upon her, and used all of his considerable influence. But for the first time in his life, he encountered an insurmountable obstacle. Aurora refused him. She refused him time and again, calmly and firmly. She was not swayed by his immense wealth or his high standing. She remembered her vow and sincerely believed that a new union would only bring a new tragedy. But Demidov was not one to retreat. Accustomed to solving any problem with money or connections, he went for the ultimate appeal. He approached the imperial couple themselves, asking them to arrange the marriage. Nicholas I and Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, who held Aurora in high favor, considered the match a brilliant one. In their eyes, marriage to Demidov was not just good fortune. It was the only way to break the evil spell and secure the future of their sorrowful lady-in-waiting. A gentle but persistent pressure began. Nicholas Thuster's daughter, Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, would later recall in her memoirs, Paul Demidov, a rich but unattractive man, wanted to marry her. She refused him twice, but he was not discouraged and continued to seek her hand. It was only after Maman spoke with her that she gave in. Under the influence of her benefactress, the Empress, Aurora finally relented. Her will was bent to the will of the monarchs. Fate was leading her to the altar once more, this time against her wishes, but with the blessing of the Tsar himself. The wedding, held in the autumn of 1836, was an event that would be talked about for decades, not only in St. Petersburg, but also in Aurora's hometown of Helsingfors. Pavel Demidov, having finally obtained his prize, decided to display the full scale of his wealth and his victory to the world. The celebrations were magnificent. Cannons fired from ships in honor of the bride, the sky was ablaze with fireworks, and the tables groaned under the weight of lavish feasts. Demidov, whose industrial empire effectively owned the entire Ural region, spared no expense. This was not just a wedding celebration, it was a demonstration of power by a man who could buy anything, even the favor of a beauty others shied away from. The younger brother of her second deceased fiancé, Mukhanov, wrote bitterly in his diary, "This woman is perfection. She seems to possess everything for happiness. She is intelligent, kind, pure of heart, beautiful, and rich." He deeply regretted that such a treasure had not come to his family, but had gone to a man whose reputation was little better than his late brother's. Demidov's wedding gift was beyond imagination. He presented Aurora with a casket made not of gold or silver, but of platinum, a metal then incredibly rare and expensive, mined from his own Ural deposits. Inside, on a velvet cushion, lay two treasures, a 4-strand necklace of pearls the size of hazelnuts, and the legendary Sancy diamond. This stone, with its rich and bloody history, once owned by French kings, was one of the crown jewels of European treasuries. Such a gift was not merely a token of love, but a symbol of status. Demidov was giving his wife something befitting a queen. Society gossips, of course, could not resist. "Imagine," they whispered behind their fans, "she is 27, but she was a virgin." And after all those stories and life in the maids of honor quarters where all sorts of things go on, Paul is beside himself with such luck. And Demidov was indeed happy. He had acquired not just a beautiful plaything, but something more. Aurora, despite the forced marriage, proved to be an ideal wife, gentle, kind, compliant, and surprisingly wise. She did not create scenes, did not demand attention, and even tried to adhere to one of the strange conditions of their marriage contract, set by Demidov himself, to appear before him as little as possible. A man of the world and a connoisseur of female variety, he had likely feared that domestic routine would quickly tire him, but the opposite happened. This detachment, this quiet dignity and inner purity in the wife he had effectively purchased, ignited in him a true, deep affection. He, who was accustomed to changing women like gloves, fell in love with his own wife like a schoolboy. In time, Aurora, too, began to thaw. Though Demidov had a difficult, capricious, and volatile character, he surrounded her with such care and luxury that her heart could not help but soften. He fulfilled her every whim. For instance, he bought a vast plot of land on Bolshaya Morskaya Street in St. Petersburg, and commissioned the famous architect Auguste de Montferrand, the builder of St. Isaac's Cathedral, to erect a palace for them. The crowning glory of this palace was a magnificent malachite room, adorned with Ural stone from the Demidov mines. Even the imperial winter palace would not have a similar hall until much later. The couple traveled extensively in Europe. In Italy, in 1837, they commissioned a portrait of Aurora from Karl Briuloff, who had just completed his masterpiece, The Last Day of Pompeii. In this portrait, she, now a married woman, appears in the full splendor of her beauty, yet her eyes still hold that same hidden sorrow. Soon, a joyous event occurred in their family. Aurora gave birth to a son, the heir to the Demidov Empire, who was named Pavel after his father. It seemed that this was it. Happiness. Stable, wealthy, protected by treasures and high station. Aurora had become a mother, the mistress of one of the most luxurious homes in St. Petersburg, and the wife of a man who, despite all his flaws, had come to sincerely love her. She almost believed that the cruel fate had retreated, that the curse had been lifted. But it had not retreated. It had merely paused, waiting to strike at the moment it would be most painful. Just 3.5 years after the wedding, in the spring of 1840, Pavel Demidov died suddenly. The cause was consumption, tuberculosis, which in those days claimed lives swiftly and mercilessly. At 32, Aurora was a widow, a rich, famous widow with a 6-month-old son in her arms. She once again donned the black of mourning. But this time, the grief was not merely external. She withdrew from society, closed the doors of her magnificent palace, and for 6 long years she did not remove her black dress, mourning not so much her husband as her latest happiness, so brutally cut short. After Pavel Demidov's passing, Aurora Karlovna became utterly convinced of her tragic mission. She resolved never to marry again, dedicating the rest of her life to two primary purposes: raising her son, Pavel, and managing the vast industrial inheritance that now belonged to the tiny boy. She became a recluse in her own palace, and society, deprived of the chance to observe her, began to spin and retell legends about her with even greater fervor. An explanation was needed for this string of tragedies. Simple misfortune was no longer enough. The human mind craved a story, a cause, an origin point for this sinister fate. And such a story was found, emerging from the depths of family lore and high society gossip, passed from mouth to mouth, acquiring new and more vivid details with each telling. "It is her mother's curse," they whispered in the drawing rooms, their voices lowered to a mysterious hush. Now, Aurora's life gave rise to talk that touched not on her personal affairs, but on the very circumstances of her birth. It was said that on the day her mother, Baroness Eva Gustava von Stjernvall, went into labor, everything went awry. It happened in Viborg, in the governor's mansion, but as ill luck would have it, not a single qualified doctor could be found. Time was running out, the situation was becoming critical, and in a panic, Karl Stjernvall, her father, was forced to send for the only available specialist, a local midwife. She was an old, hunched woman, rumored to be skilled with herbs and incantations, but also frighteningly unattractive and unkempt. When this strange figure was ushered into the birthing chamber, the young aristocrat, racked with pain and fear, experienced a profound shock. Before her stood a creature that seemed to have stepped out of some dark medieval fable. Instead of gratitude or relief, words of horror and revulsion escaped the Baroness's lips. She was terrified, not so much for herself, but for the child who was to be brought into the world by this woman she perceived as a witch. She insulted the midwife, ordering her to be taken away. The old woman, her face already a mask of wrinkles, froze with offense. Her help had been rejected, her dignity scorned. And then, according to the legend, she drew herself up to her full small height, fixed her faded but furious eyes upon the Baroness, and uttered the words that would become the curse. "You fear my ugliness?" she allegedly hissed. "Very well. Your daughter will grow to be a beauty, the likes of which the world has never seen. But her beauty will bring her no joy. It will not be a gift, but a punishment. All who truly love her will meet a sorrowful end. She will carry the dawn on her lips and twilight in her heart, and every kiss she gives will bring her chosen one closer to his final hour." Having said this, she turned and departed in silence, leaving the terrified mother to be alone with her fear and those dreadful words. Soon after, a baby girl was born, whose beauty was astonishing from her very first days. She was given the name Aurora, the dawn. But now, in light of all that followed, the name sounded like a cruel mockery. The legend of the midwife's curse provided a simple and comprehensible, albeit chilling, explanation for everything. It transformed Aurora from a merely unhappy woman into the heroine of a Gothic novel, a victim of an ancient feud, whose destiny was sealed before she was even born. And this story, whether true or not, fit the canvas of her life perfectly. making her all the more mysterious and alluring. Rumors of the midwife's curse, of the Black Widow Demidova, whose wealth was the price for the lives of her men, naturally reached every corner of St. Petersburg society. They were heard by Colonel Andrei Nikolaevich Karamzin, a man of brilliant intellect and impeccable reputation, the son of the great historian Nikolai Karamzin, author of The History of the Russian State. He was the very embodiment of honor and nobility. He heard the gossip and, unlike many, saw nothing in it but cruel popular slander. And then he saw her. He saw Aurora, no longer a young debutante, but a mature woman of 38, whose beauty had only deepened and been spiritualized by her suffering. From that moment on, for him, there were no more rumors, no more superstitions. He saw only her, and everything else in the world ceased to matter. Their meeting took place at one of the rare society evenings that Aurora still occasionally attended. The colonel asked her to dance. As it happened, the orchestra was playing that very mazurka, Aurora, which Vygotsky had once dedicated to her. In the whirl of the dance, to the sounds of the melody that bore her name, Andrei Karamzin, a man usually reserved and a few words, took a desperate step. He confessed his feelings to her. Aurora, accustomed to compliments but long unaccustomed to sincerity, was stunned. A flicker of fear crossed her eyes. She tried to stop him, resorting to the last argument she had. "I am 8 years older than you. I bring misfortune to men." She threw up every barrier she could: age, reputation, her own deep-seated fear. But Karamzin's reply was disarmingly simple and noble. He looked at her gently and spoke the words that shattered all her defenses. "I am an officer, madame. Death is my lot." In those words was everything: the fatalism of a warrior, a contempt for superstition, and most importantly, a readiness to accept her with her entire tragic history. He did not fear her curse, because his own life was already a constant dance with risk. At last, after a long and persistent courtship, Aurora yielded. She gave her consent, realizing that she had loved this man, perhaps even before he confessed it, but had been too afraid to admit it to herself. In 1846, for the third time in her life, she walked down the aisle. But this wedding was different. It was quiet, modest, without cannons or fireworks. It was a union not of two fortunes, but of two mature, wounded souls who had found peace and understanding in one another. And Aurora finally found what she had dreamed of her entire life: simple, quiet, domestic happiness. The newlyweds were immensely happy. Andrei Nikolaevich proved to be not only a loving husband, but also a wonderful stepfather. He quickly bonded with Aurora's young son, Pavel Demidov, and became his official guardian, giving the boy the fatherly care he had been denied. To spend more time with his family, Karamzin even retired from the military. Their home on Bolshaya Morskaya, once a symbol of cold luxury, was transformed into a warm and welcoming salon. There were no noisy balls, but instead literary evenings, where new works were read, charades were played, and intelligent, heartfelt conversations flowed. It was an oasis of intellect and warmth in the heart of the bustling capital. Pyotr Vyazemsky, a frequent guest, penned a playful but poignant epigram: "Aurora shines for us, we have no need of the sun. For our souls and for our eyes there is both flame and light." This cloudless happiness lasted for 8 years. 8 years of peace, love, and harmony. It seemed as though fate had finally retreated, defeated by the power of true affection and the nobility of her chosen one. But in 1853, the world turned upside down once more. The Crimean War began, and in Andrei Karamzin, the retired colonel, the patriot and warrior, awoke. The military man has reawakened in Andrei with a patriotic fervor that darkens my thoughts of the future. Aurora wrote anxiously to her sister. Her worst fears were coming true. He could not stand aside while his motherland was in danger. Andrei Nikolaevich voluntarily returned to service and left for the front, receiving a command in the active army. Aurora accompanied her husband as far as Moscow. They would never see each other again. Fate dealt its final, most cruel blow. On May 16, 1854, Colonel Karamzin was leading a cavalry detachment on a reconnaissance mission in Wallachia in modern-day Romania. Displaying what his contemporaries called excessive, almost reckless heroism, he engaged a superior enemy force. In that battle, he was killed, along with 19 other officers and 139 soldiers. For Aurora, this news was the end of the world. But destiny had one last soul-chilling ordeal in store for her. A close family friend, the poet Fyodor Tyutchev, wrote to his daughter. It was a Monday when the unfortunate woman learned of her husband's death, and the next day, on Tuesday, she receives a letter from him, a letter of several pages, full of life, animation, and cheer. The letter is dated May 15th, and on the 16th, he was killed. To receive a message from the world of the living, from one who was already in the world of the dead. It was the final chord of her personal tragedy, after which an eternal winter descended upon her soul. At the age of 46, Aurora Karlovna-Karamzina was widowed for a second time. But while a glimmer of hope for the future had remained after Demidov's passing, it was now extinguished forever. The mourning attire she donned after Andrei's death would never be set aside for the rest of her days. It was not merely a symbol of grief, but her final choice, her way of telling the world that her personal story was over. She closed the doors to her heart for good, becoming a living monument to her own fate. From then on, her life was devoted to others, to raising her son, caring for her numerous nieces and nephews, for whom she became a second mother, and to large-scale philanthropy. Her immense fortune, inherited from her first husband, now served not luxury, but the needs of the less fortunate. She opened orphanages, schools, and hospitals, becoming one of the most renowned and respected philanthropists of her time. She lived an astonishingly long life, as if fate, having taken everything she held dear, had granted her longevity as a cruel form of compensation. She witnessed the passing of entire eras. Born under Alexander I, she outlived the reigns of Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III, and departed this world at the dawn of Nicholas II's reign in 1902. She was 94 years old. She outlived them all, her sisters, her friends and enemies, her admirers. She even outlived her only deeply beloved son Pavel, and then his wife, Maria Meshcherskaya, the very princess who had once been the first youthful love of the future emperor Alexander III. Aurora watched as her world, a world of balls, duels, and splendid courts, faded into the past becoming the stuff of historical novels. She herself had become history, a legend, the fatal Aurora, whose image for new generations was inseparable from the mystical aura of the Black Bride and Black Widow. But her name remains in history for more than just her tragic destiny. There is another, much brighter legend associated with her, one that lives on to this day. It is said that Emperor Nicholas I himself, captivated by the beauty of the young lady-in-waiting Stjernvall, ordered a new frigate of the Baltic fleet to be named in her honor. "We shall call her Aurora," he allegedly declared, in tribute to one of the most beautiful women in St. Petersburg. Later, when the age of sail gave way to steam and steel, this glorious name was traditionally passed down to a new armored cruiser. The very same cruiser, Aurora, whose blank shot in October 1917 would signal the beginning of a new Soviet era. Thus, the name of a woman whose life was a series of personal tragedies became inscribed in one of the most dramatic moments of Russian history, a symbol not of a morning dawn, but a revolutionary one. And here, at the very end, our story comes full circle, returning to the prophetic lines with which we began. Do you remember the poet Ivan Maslov, whose quote opened our tale? The most astounding part of his story is that he never saw Aurora Karlovna in person. He was born much later and fell in love not with the woman, but with her image, with one of her youthful portraits, perhaps the very one painted by Bryullov. The image of the fatal beauty so seized his imagination that he began working on a grand poem dedicated to her. But fate, it seemed, was jealous of its chosen one, even of those who touched her only in their thoughts. The poet fell suddenly ill and passed away at a young age, continuing to polish the lines of those fateful verses until his final moments on his hospital bed. And so, the seal of her destiny, like some invisible radiation, acted even across time and space, through canvas and paint, proving that some legends are more powerful than life itself.